Hello and welcome. From the outside, it looks like they lead the good life. Singapore's youth grows up in a safe environment, in a thriving economy, where unemployment is at a 6-year low of just over 2%. But underneath this veneer, what issues and concerns do they face? Do they want greater freedom of expression? And do they believe the controlled environment in which they live has a negative or positive influence on society? We've brought together a panel of 6 university students to find out what they think their future holds and to shed light on the difficulties that confront them. I want to welcome you all into the show.
Thank you.
Zainab, I'm going to start with you and ask, if someone was to ask you what perceptions of Singapore are wrong, what is it that they don't really know about Singapore? What is the most important thing that stands out in your mind?
That Singaporeans can't speak proper English. Because when I was in the US, they're like, aren't you a part of China? And when I go to India, they think that I'm part of China as well. And they're like, oh, you actually speak English and you speak proper English. And I think that's something that it's a wrong perception, and I don't blame it. And I don't blame people for them, because many people do give out this they give out Singlish, and hence it's a perception that they have. But if they speak to more people, they'll realize that no, it's not actually Singlish, and many of us speak good standard English.
But Natasha, that's particularly in the US, and I know you were in the US as a student recently. Beyond that, if you look at Singapore in the region, how you relate to your neighbours, how do you think Singapore is perceived, and how do they misunderstand Singapore?
I think when you compare with our neighbours, a lot of people look at Singapore as being very elite. They think that we have a very high perception of ourselves and we look down on our neighbours. So I think when you talk about that, some perceive us as being arrogant or proud, and I think that's a wrong perception of how you should view Singaporeans.
It is quite I mean, it's known to be quite a sort of strong and rigid society. And Sarah, if I can ask you, I mean, to what extent do you find life is too controlled here?
Well, basically, when people think of Singapore, they think the government controls our lives and that Singapore's a nanny state. So whatever the government says, we do. But essentially, I think the government's trying to open up, and that they're giving more options to youth to air their voice, air their views. And well, slowly, I think that we're opening up. And as more of us get educated, I guess more debates will occur, and yeah, it will be good for the country. But I don't think. Yep, sorry. So,
sorry, Sarah. I was going to say, Ili, you know, to what extent do you feel that you know, what you get in terms of opportunities in Singapore are better than anywhere else? You've travelled, all of you I know have travelled, and comparing it with other places, is this the best place you can think of in terms of opportunity?
I think for Singaporean youths, we fall quite somewhere in the middle. We're relatively better off, more opportunities for us compared to our neighbouring countries in the region. But if you compare us to the Western counterparts, there are more opportunities out in the global stage, of course. But Singapore is slowly but surely gaining foot in more areas in the world. Yep.
Ranjini, if I was to ask you your concerns, what stands out in your mind about life in Singapore that you would like to see addressed? What comes to mind?
There are certain issues that I think we are still at a very nascent beginning that I think we need to trash out. For example, if we talk about freedom of expression to even talk about changing some of the legislation in Singapore. And when we talk about Singapore being, you know, a first world country and attracting immigrants from all around the world, we want to have laws and codes of practice that kind of encourage immigration here and encourage them to take up permanent residency here. But I think there are some laws that are still discriminatory, and I think with sort of a loosening up of freedom of, you know, to allow more people to speak up about certain things, well, not necessarily true that it might get some sort of fruitful outcome, because there could be the negative side of people, you know, talking about, you know, hate speech, or, you know, that we don't want to have more immigrants to come in or whatever. But then I think if we allow that free marketplace of ideas to kind of to grow, it could lead to something better. So that's an area of concern that I have. Yeah.
Then I'm coming back around to you and asking, you know, what is it that you would like to do that right now you're not allowed to do in Singapore?
I'd like to be able to open the newspaper and read something that it's not completely in support of PAP. I would say actually not in complete support, but totally against it. I mean, it's something I haven't read in a long time, and if I would like to read it, I think I would have to wait some time first.
So what you want is more freedom of expression in the newspapers, more open media, is that really what it is?
Yeah, more open media, because I think that's how the society will grow. Unless we have an open media, growth is limited. I mean, it's a saying, unless you you open up your boundaries and you let them loose, that's when it'll grow, and I think that's really needed.
So how do you get your information? What's your main source of knowing what's going on around you?
Around me, I read the Straits Times every morning, but other than that, I read interesting blogs of my professors and people around me whom I think have a different opinion to give and who give me a different side to things, because these people can't publish their work on the real, they can only publish their work on alternative media, and when I read it on these sites, I'm like, I never thought of this, and what if this would come out on paper? What difference would it make? How about if our other students read this? I think it would give a really good perspective, but it'll take time, but I'm sure it'll come.
So Natasha, blogging is a big thing here then? It's a great way to express yourselves?
I think it's a great way. I also think it's a very good way to give an alternative perspective, because a lot of times when you open newspaper, you only get one perspective, which generally tends to be the PAP's perspective. But during the general election, the blogs were a great way to know what was really going on in the heartlands. You saw people going to opposition rallies, which the main newspaper didn't show. So I guess blogging is a good way to find alternative perspectives.
And it was tolerated?
It was tolerated. I mean, some people were saying like, oh no, it's not this way, but it was tolerated and it generated a lot of interest in the opposition, which I think is very good for the political scene now. Yeah.
RANJINI, you wanted to add something to this?
Yeah, actually, I was just thinking when you're talking about blogging, you know, about citizen journalism, I think that's something that we really need in Singapore, a sort of like a mechanism for a watchdog to take, you know, to take cognizance of what's happening in the government and, you know, around us. But in some instances, I think in Singapore, there are cases when you see, for example, seditious blogging, or for example, things like you know, religiously, very sensitive information, and it could sort of create a backlash. And you know, we had an instance where someone actually got to jail for that. And I think some things, you know, like going to jail, for example, for posting a seditious comment on race or something like that, is not going to change a person's perception about race. It's only going to aggravate, you know, this racism against.
Well, I have to ask you then, Sarah, to what extent are you willing to give up your freedom of expression or elements of your freedom of expression in order to have this sense of, say, you know, social security to some degree, or at least a feeling that people aren't doing something seditious or whatever?
Well, more importantly, my stand on this is that, like, yeah, the government should give us more sense of freedom, because I think the situation now is that a lot of us have, like, a lot of perspectives to share, but for me personally, I think we feel that we're kind of scared to air our views, because we're like, oh no, we might end up in jail tomorrow, or like we'll see some lawyers at our
Is it really
doors.
that serious a concern? Do you really think you'd end up in jail if you had your views?
Yeah, I guess so. As in, not my views, but supposing if I did have some radical views, you know, and I posted it up on the blog, like, who knows, a government official might appear on my door the next day. So I guess if people like around my age have that kind of mentality, then naturally they just won't air their views at all. But personally, about how much I would want to give up my freedom of expression, well, as long as people exercise this freedom with responsibility, yep, everything should go fine. But yeah, the government then should educate us, I guess, on how responsible we should be and things like that, yeah.
Now, Eileen, it's interesting, you're in hijab. You have it covered in some parts of the world now, even in countries, the Muslim countries, it's an issue of debate. I mean, controversial issue of debate. Turkey, say in Europe, which isn't a Muslim, I mean, France is not a Muslim country, but has always had freedom of expression. Are those kind of issues ever raised here in Singapore?
Actually, in recent years, we had cases of issues about the hijab, because there were cases where students entering school, into mainstream schools, who wanted to don the hijab in school, and the whole debate about the school uniform and uniformity, you're not allowed to don any religious articles when you go to school. You know, there was a debate for a short time, but I think the Singapore society is not that reactive yet to actually create that big an uproar over this hijab issue. Most of the Singapore society is still very compliant. We tend to strike a balance, and you know, we take the middle route instead of going against the mainstream. Yeah, so the uproar was just for that short time, involving a few parties, and it stopped there.
Now, of course, as you know, in some parts of the world there would be an argument, a debate, and Ranjini, in this case, you know, you may not have a big outcry over hijab, but when it comes to issues like drugs and you know, alcohol and so on, or problems with alcohol, which are prevalent in other parts among youth, I guess you also are able to escape that with the more moderate society here?
Yeah, that's right. Well, in certain aspects, I guess you could say, in, let's say, sort of in alcohols and drugs, I would say we're more or less protected. In pornography, you know, the government censors pornography and things like that, which are you know, bad for children who are growing up, whatever. But in terms of political expression, political debate, dialogue, even race. I mean, I believe we should talk about race. I mean, in Singapore, it's a very racialized country. We kind of like to categorize people and pigeonhole them into races. And when we do that, sometimes we have these stereotypes and, you know, preconceived notions. We don't really talk to people of another race as openly because, you know, we're afraid that, you know, we might cross the line or say something insulting or something like that. But you see, if we don't allow that debate, that discussion about race or religion for that matter, we're all just going to be ignorant.
Where does that leave you, someone who's half Chinese, half Indian?
Well, yeah, okay. Basically, being mixed, being raised, you know, in a family which is mixed, basically, I never kind of fell into any category. So, but in Singapore, we have a system where we actually, you know, on our IDs, we have to have a race category. And so, if you're not Indian, Chinese, or Malay, you're others.
So you're others, are you?
Well, I'm not exactly others because in Singapore we follow this system where we follow our dad. So by default, my dad is Indian. They categorize me as an Indian. So there's always this sort of pressure, or I think this obsession to kind of categorize things and define things.
Well, JC, I mean, you've travelled. Recently you were travelling throughout the Middle East. When you look at the societies there, when you look at what life was like, you went to Dubai, Doha, you went through the Gulf states as well. How did you compare life there with Singapore?
I think for Dubai, it's roughly, because maybe it's so cosmopolitan, so it's roughly the same as in Singapore. I felt that the only difference was that when I walked through a shopping center, they dress differently. But their sense of tolerance is the same.
How, Zainab, you were recently in America.
Yep.
How did you regard life there compared with Singapore?
I think life there was a lot more, okay, it's a very cliched term, but yes, students in America are a lot more individualistic. I just hope, I think I'm generalizing, but well, for the class that I attended as well, it was pretty much the case. And even my professor came up to me and said, I thank you and Natasha, who was with me in the course, for being in this class because you gave my students a different perspective. They never knew. They came up to me and like, so you're a Muslim. Why is polygamy allowed? And I stood there and I tried to explain it to them and I'm like, yeah, it's so and so. And they're like, oh, we never knew that. And all we knew about Muslim was terrorism.
Right,
so I'm like,
but in terms of when you say, you know, they were very individualistic, it sounds like you're almost critical of that.
No, I'm not critical. It's probably a good thing in certain aspects because they think of themselves first before others, and in certain instances that might be good.
That's selfish, that's not individualistic.
Yeah, you could say it's selfish, right? But I think in certain sense you have to put yourself before others, otherwise you're just going to keep giving in and you're never going to have a stand of your own.
So in terms of where you stand as world citizens, Natasha, I mean, to what extent do you feel what you have in Singapore does place you in the world in a way that will allow you to compete?
I think that being Singaporean and being multiracial helps me interact with other people as compared to, let's say, when you go to America and everybody is very into themselves and they're looking at how they are. I have a wider perspective because I get to be friends with people of different races. So when I go out there, I'm able to understand and I can say be a bit more tolerant of other people as well. So that helps me interact better with everyone else and see their point of view.
Not meaning to put you on the spot, but
yeah.
I mean, if you compare life, you know, you're in California recently, compare life in California with life in Singapore, where would you ultimately feel more comfortable, the way society runs? And I'm not going to get you in trouble with your parents, I don't mean it that way. I mean, in terms of your sense of freedom, what you could do.
I really liked California when I was there because there was a sense of freedom because people were able to say what they want compared to Singapore, where you always have to be a bit more on your guard. Is someone going to come get me if I say something wrong? I was there, and they were having a campaign to impeach Bush. And so I was, and they were doing it openly, and I was like, okay, this would never happen in Singapore, and I liked it because you get to see different points of view. So while you had impeach Bush, there was also support Bush. So I can't really say which part I would like to stay in. I like Singapore a lot. It has given me so much, and I think I can give so much back. But at the same time, there's so much that the outside world has that Singapore needs to get. So I think, but we're moving in the right direction.
So who are your role models? If you were to pick out, you know, people out there in the world who you could say were role model types of characters, who automatically comes to mind? Don't just try and think of good ones because you feel you have to. Who automatically? Don't say Paris Hilton, though.
Well, okay. Okay, since I do watch Oprah Winfrey quite often. No, it's not her. It's actually one of her guests on her show, which is actually Queen Rania of Jordan. Yeah. Well, besides being really beautiful, I think. Well, I guess she's really confident, and I think she's a good role model for Muslim women, which, I mean, I'm Muslim, so I look up to her, and I like how she carries herself and how she's basically a good ambassador for the religion and also for her country.
So Ranjini, I thought, where do you see Singapore in a dozen years from now? How would your life be different?
In a dozen years from now, I think Singapore would have a stronger opposition.
So politics is important, it sounds like, for you guys.
Well, yeah, I think it is very important because politics it's almost everything, but sometimes it's like nothing.
You talk about it as if it's preordained, and yet you sort of are hoping that there would be change.
Well, I think there will be change, yes. In political expression in Singapore, definitely we need change. I mean, we always talk about America being the sort of the cradle of, you know, bringing personal liberty, democracy, and freedom to the rest of the world. But I don't think you can compare it as like an East-West paradigm, because in Asia we also value personal liberties and freedom. It's just we're not as expressive maybe yet. So in a dozen years, I reckon we'd have public discourse more, and yeah, I think we'd be pretty much, well, right now we're at 146 on the press freedom ranking, so I hope maybe like...
Well, there's nowhere else to go but up then, yeah? Well, listen, I want to thank you all very much for taking part in this, ladies and gentlemen, for giving us your views candidly on life here in Singapore. Good luck with everything.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right. And that's it for our special panel of students here in Singapore. Hope you enjoyed that debate, and we'll see you next time. Street Talk's coming up next.
Da